Welcome to Mind, Body, Health, and Politics. I'm your host, Dr. Richard Lewis Miller. The mission is to enhance physical and mental well-being and encourage community. And when I say community, what I mean is I believe that human beings are friendly tribal animals. And when we associate together in small enough numbers where we know each other by face or possibly by name, we're collaborative and cooperative. We must also recognize that there is a very small percentage of us, thankfully very small, who are motivated by what we call perverse incentives. And they're motivated by power, greed, and money. And it's our job to be vigilant about those folks so that we maintain democracy and our republic. I have the great privilege of bringing to you a pioneer and a visionary in psychedelic medicine, Dr. Rick Strassman. Many of you already know Rick from his groundbreaking book, DMT, The Spirit Molecule, which is sold, I believe, in 14 countries and approximately 250,000 copies and rising. Welcome to Mind, Body, Health, and Politics, Rick.
Well, thanks, Richard. Great to be on your show.
You know, I was reading in your book, it was on page 144, that you were also influenced by Leo Zeff. And it turns out at the exact same time in history in the 1980s that I was influenced by Leo Zeff because he was a neighbor of, Leo was a neighbor of mine. He was about 8 houses down the street. And we got to know one another. And I soon became his student. He became my mentor. And I ingested various kinds of psychedelic medicines in my mouth, in my rectum. And Leo did the most interesting thing. During the 1980s, I had founded a chemical dependence program called Coke Enders Alcohol and Drug Program. And we did a 5-day residential to kick off everybody's program at Wilbur Hot Spring. A very intense program, 30 hours of group therapy, individual therapy. We did yoga, but I called it stretching. We did a meditation, but I called it mind clearing. We did nutrition training, but we called it learning about fuel. You know, disguising things to make them more palatable to chemically dependent people. And Leo says to me one day, I'd like to attend the 5-day program.
Yeah, great.
So here was cherubic. I mean, remember him, he was a cherubic person in his demeanor. And I said, Leo, you want to come to a chemical dependent residential? He said, yes, I've got something I want to deal with. I said, please come as my personal guest. So the first night of the program, we're all sitting in a circle, and it was my custom after introductions for each person to go to their room and bring every single drop of paraphernalia and drugs that they brought with them. Then I would have them go to the parking lot and clean out their cars and bring that to the room. And it was typically boxes and boxes of stuff that were in the middle of the room. There was Leo sitting with bags upon bags of Cheetos, chocolate knobs, different kinds of jelly beans. I mean, like he was a junk food king. And he's sitting in a room with profoundly addicted heroin, cocaine, alcohol, garbage heads, taking all three. And they saw his collection. He was a hit overnight. It was really, really a great thing.
Yeah. Whenever I attended meetings that Leo were at, you would always see him wondering where the food was. He'd be asking people, where's the food? Yeah, he just loved to eat.
Leo Zeff, The Secret Chief, is the name of the book that was written about him. It's worth reading. You want to get to it.
Yeah, my experience with Leo was rather limited. I met him in the mid 80s, 86, maybe 87. So I arranged to do an Ibogaine session with him, which we did the next year. And then the picture trip, that LSD and, Harmaline trip. So those were the two experiences that I had supervised by him, and they were momentous, especially the Ibogaine one.
What music did he play? You
Uh,
recall?
he, he just brought out his box of cassettes. I didn't look that carefully. I think he played some African music. Obviously for the Ibogaine session. One of the striking things about the way that he would sit for my sessions is that he would just read a paperback novel, like a romance novel. He'd just be kind of, flipping. He'd be reading it, but it was very, light. Something that he could distract himself from very easily if he needed to pay attention.
My most profound experience with him was when he gave me 500 micrograms of LSD, put eye shades on me, and put headphones on me, and had me lay down on the couch where I stayed for about 8 hours. He played Beethoven. I came away from that experience so focused on Beethoven and his genius that I really feel like I missed out on some areas of looking at myself because I was so overwhelmed by his genius at creating this music. And afterwards, I thought, Rick, and this is something you talk about in your book, your latest book, I'm never going to use music again. I'm going to do silence because whatever music I listen to, I'm so suggestible under the influence of this medicine. The music itself is going to direct my journey. And I would rather either direct it myself with my intention or let whatever comes to me come, but to be so taken. So that was one experience. And the other was at another time on a large dose. And this was the most important experience, really. He came over to me, took off my eye shades, took off the headphones, and he took my hand and he looked into my eyes. And I had the sensation, real or not, that he was transmitting to me that which he had inside of him. And it was a glorious moment, which to this moment still fills me when I even think about it. I'm not claiming that such transmissions do or do not take place. I'm not commenting on it. I'm just telling a story.
Yeah, I mean, it felt that way.
Like it felt that way.
Yeah, like the transmission was
Correct.
Occurring. When Leo was holding your hand, did it feel like your hand was in a rock, like in a stone, like King Arthur's sword?
It felt like my hand was in not too hot, but molten honey, golden honey.
Yeah, I mean, he was quite a guy. Well, during my Ibogaine experience, I was kind of nervous at a certain point, and I said, I need some reassurance. So he laid on top of me, face to face, chest to chest, belly to belly, arm to arm, leg to leg. He just laid on me. It was the damnedest thing, but I got grounded. I was calmed down after a few minutes. He got up and said, "Are you all right?" And yeah, so very intuitive guy.
Very. He went from the laying on of hands to the laying on of body.
What's interesting is in the Book of Kings, I think, there's a story in there about Elisha, Elijah's disciple, and he brings a child back from death by lying on him, face to face, hands to hands, arms to arms.
Mm-hmm.
So after I discovered that narrative in the Book of Kings, I wondered if Leo may have learned it from there.
That's a great observation. Okay, on to some big topics. I'll mention out loud that I talked to you a little bit before we went on air about talking about a few topics other than your book that we are definitely going to get to. So listeners know that we're going to be talking about Rick's book. Rick, the political, what are your thoughts about the political divide in this country, which seems more virulent than at any other time in my lifetime?
Well, I do think about it, and I do keep up with news, even though I live in a remote part of the country. I mean, there's the internet, and you can learn whatever you want to learn, or keep in touch with with whatever you want to keep in touch with. Well, I mean, I've got a couple of fundamental tenets when it comes to looking at history. Um, One is that there's evil in the world just as much as there's good. So that's one of my foundational beliefs is that there is an existent evil that seeks destruction and chaos and pain and suffering. Just as that's just as real as good, which is loving, increases bounty, happiness, possessions, peace. Um, so I think that there's always a battle between good and evil. And my Zen Buddhism teacher used to say it's always 51 to 49, good versus evil, which bespeaks the importance of every individual, doing everything that they can to promote the good. You can't be that passive, or you can't be passive and expect things to work out. Something else I consider too is the trajectory of history. Some people think it repeats, that history is circular, and with reincarnation and those kinds of ideas, which I inherited from my study of Zen. I was of that belief, that history is always repeating itself. There's multiple infinite incarnations. But for the last 20, 25 years or so, I've been studying the Jewish worldview, which takes a linear point of view. That history had a beginning. It's occurring now. It's taking place now. At some point in the future, it will end. At least our understanding of history will end. And that's variously described as the Messianic era or the world to come. And there are certain criteria which define it. And those criteria are biblical. And they've been kind of laid out by the philosophers. So there's also the understanding of, I guess, God being in charge of everything, even though it isn't, God up there, pulling strings. God put together the system of cause and effect, which regulates, which regulates the laws of nature and ethical and moral laws. So those laws are not random. Certain things occur as a result of certain precedents. Things are the way now because of how they were before, and things in the future will be the way that they are because of what's happening now. So those laws of nature, social laws, follow some kind of pattern. It's not random. Those laws aren't random. For example, if you're angry and you stub your toe, that discourages you from stubbing your toe. If you're good to your neighbor, chances are you'll get good in return, and there'll be more peace. So those laws of nature and laws of society were created and are sustained, at least from my point of view, my worldview, by dint of God. God created and sustains those laws of nature and social intercourse, which regulate our lives, which control our lives, which determine history, what people decide, what people don't decide. So I see the unfolding of history as the unfolding of God's plan. and it's really hard to fathom. So I stay in, I stay, tuned to, to history in the making, current events. But I don't get all that. Well, I mean, it kind of cuts both ways. You know, there, there are times that I am quite despondent, quite disheartened, and other times I figure, well, it's God's plan, and we don't really know what that is. You have to hope that it's for the best. I have some friends that are who are quite keen on unmasking, those who are kind of manipulating current events, either in the public eye or behind the scenes. And he's got it pretty well worked out, and he gets quite upset about it. I think it keeps him from relating to the rest of the world as facile and comfortable manner as he might. But beyond that, it's you think about these people as making decisions and being in positions that they are because of the laws of nature and the laws of cause and effect and how society works. With respect to democracy being at risk, I'm a real student of the Holocaust and concentration camps. The literature. What happened in Nazi Germany. How did the most refined society in Western Europe descend to that level of barbarity? And it seemed that most of Germany was not that interested in democracy, that they weren't that interested in it. They just wanted things to be better, and they didn't care, how that was going to take place. So Hitler, was a genius. He could blame, he could incite anger, and he, promised everything. So the consensus, at least from my understanding, is that there wasn't as much interest in democracy as there was in, I guess, their economy, their welfare, the market, the commercial situation.
Are we not facing the same kind of situation here, where we have pushed down the middle class and the lower class? Where we have a situation where 50% of the United States, it is reported that with 50% of the United States, if their refrigerator breaks, they don't have enough money for a refrigerator. And the sociologists tell us, and I learned this in my first course in social psychology in graduate school, that if you push the population down economically far enough and long enough, they will rise up, and there'll be either a civil war or a revolution. And it seems as though Trump is talking to those people, and he's certainly talking similar language to the kind of language that we heard from Hitler.
Yeah, and most people would prefer believing him or somebody else in lieu of free elections, democratically elected officials. Yeah. So, in a way, there needs to be some counterforce developing. But, like you're saying, it's the inequality. Philo of Alexandria, back at the turn of the Common Era, I went through a Philo phase some years ago. And a point he makes repeatedly is that inequality leads to revolution.
Yes, inequality leads to revolution. You make a point in your book, the Psychedelic Handbook, that we're going to pivot to now. You make a point of saying that these medicines can serve, you don't use the word evil, but you point out that they could serve racists to bolster themselves as well as do good. Tell us your thoughts on how a medicine that facilitates empathy, such as MDMA, which we're going to be talking about, how can a medicine that facilitates empathy bolster racism, misogyny, white supremacy, hate?
Well, it makes you take a more, I guess, expansive or more all-inclusive view of what psychedelics do. My feeling is that the best term for these substances is psychedelic, mind manifesting or mind disclosing. And that's because they work on the mind. They work on what's already in the mind, more or less conscious. But what's already in the mind. I don't think they intrinsically are good or bad. I think they can be used for good if you have a good psyche, as it were, and for bad if it's the other way around. The case in point that I bring up ad nauseum is that of Charles Manson and the way those folks used LSD. It cemented beliefs that were already there, not quite well formed, not quite as solid as they became under the influence of LSD over months and months. But still, it depends on what you're empathic with. I mean, you can empathize with Charles Manson, and that wouldn't be a good place. But still, if you loved him and he loved you, there'd be some synergy, and your beliefs would move in the same direction. Your behaviors, your actions would move in a certain direction, consistent with your feelings and with your thoughts, which are made even more compelling under the influence of psychedelics. Um, One of the more speculative, obscure, chapters in the book, the Psychedelic Handbook, is about psychedelics being super placebos. They will help you manifest what you want to manifest or what you hope will manifest. So if you're feeling, down and out, kicked around by society, you could take LSD with somebody like Charles Manson and become a serial killer. You could also, if you're depressed or you want your meditation to improve, you want to be a nicer person, if those ideas are pre-existing, then psychedelics will help you attain to them as well.
Let's pivot now to you giving us a relatively brief, not too brief, but a relatively brief overview of your book. Tell us about the four prominent psychedelics that you're mostly concerned with: LSD, psilocybin, DMT, and ayahuasca. And after you give us a little overview and mention those four, then I'm going to ask you to just tell us a bit about the major benefits and liabilities of each of these four.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, even, before, the content of the book, maybe I could, share, my motivation for writing it in the first place.
Thank you.
Yeah. It wasn't an easy book to write because I kind of had to put my money where my mouth was. If I'm going to proclaim myself as an expert, I really needed to bone up on what's the latest, what's known, what's not known, what's the state of the art. I think ultimately I decided to write the book because of the need to provide a more balanced educational curriculum with respect to the psychedelics. I think with the rush to judgment, saying how great they are and how minimally detrimental adverse effects are, the commercialization, they're being touted as panaceas. It just didn't seem right. I mean, my work at UNM in Albuquerque giving DMT was the first human study or the first new human study in this country in a long, long time. It basically opened, the door to the American Renaissance and, clinical research with the psychedelics. So I felt some responsibility, for better or, for worse, true or not. I feel some responsibility to keep the train on the rails. And this is even in response, to material coming out of academic centers, the public, lay media. It's coming from everywhere, commercial media and the institution. So I thought I would present a sober, level-headed approach, the pros and cons. And I think the unique character of the book is it's written by somebody who's been around, who knows what they're talking about. I've done the research. I've been interested studying psychedelics since I was 18 years old. So it's a field that's near and dear to me, and I know my way around it. And I think education, like you said earlier in the show, is key to optimizing benefits and to minimizing detriment.
So, with that as an introduction to the why you took on the book, let's get into as I said, relatively brief description of the 4 major psychedelic medicines, and then something about their benefits and liabilities. Then we're going to get drilled down into specifics.
Well, okay. Well, how do I divide it up? Well, the classical psychedelics, that's one division. So the classical compounds are pharmacologically similar, and they include LSD, psilocybin, DMT, and mescaline. They stimulate what's called the serotonin 2A receptor in parts of the brain where you would think those receptors are located, emotional centers, visual centers, cognitive centers, and so on. So they're mostly found in the world of nature other than LSD. LSD is synthetic. DMT is in a number of plants, including ayahuasca, psilocybin in mushrooms, and mescaline in the peyote cactus and the San Pedro cactus. So then so it also includes 5-methoxy-DMT, which is the toad. Even though pharmacologically and acute effects are slightly dissimilar, they're still in the ballpark. And I also include ibogaine, but that could be debatable because ibogaine is a very complex molecule. So then I talk about MDMA, which pharmacologically is distinct from the classical compounds. Instead of stimulating certain receptors, it stimulates the release of neurotransmitters onto those receptors, specifically dopamine and serotonin. I think you could call it a quasi-psychedelic. It isn't like a classical compound with a lot of visual things and fragmentation of your sense of self. It's more empathogenic, like you were saying, and tactogenic. The effects are more primarily emotional. They can be slightly psychedelic, but still the primary characteristic of those compounds is the enhancement of empathy. And it can be empathy, for yourself as well as, for other people. And ketamine, which is very popular now. There's ketamine clinics springing up everywhere to treat any number of things. The main indication is for treatment-resistant depression, but it's being used for pretty much everything. Psychotherapeutic effects, post PTSD and alcoholism, those kinds of things. But for wellness, for couples therapy, smaller doses. So that's extremely popular. In a way, it's psychedelics first foothold in medical use at a widespread level. I think it may not turn out to be all that durable in terms of its utility out there, but I think it paved the way for other compounds to be used in the same kind of setting, MDMA and psilocybin, for example.
Is there hard research to back ketamine, or is it because it is an off use of something that happened to be legal and it's being used as a foot in the door?
Well, it is quite helpful in cases of depression, which hasn't responded to traditional antidepressants. Yeah, that's been well established. And there are an increasing number of studies looking at using it for other conditions that classical psychedelics are helpful for, like alcoholism and PTSD. And I've heard stories or cases of small doses of ketamine being used as a lozenge, like sublingual, and you do couples therapy. Um, your inhibitions are lowered, and you're more comfortable sharing and expressing emotion. Ketamine can be kind of habit forming, which is one of the drawbacks. I think that may ultimately limits it, uh, limit its use. And one more point about ketamine, which is interesting, is it's being used in emergency rooms to treat suicidal people. You give them ketamine and they stop feeling suicidal, and you can send them home and get them engaged in outpatient therapy.
I was taught by Leo that having a guide was imperative whenever you took any psychedelic other than microdosing.
Mm-hmm.
He felt he felt very strongly that a guide, what's now being called a sitter. I'm not sure a sitter is the same as a guide, by the way, and I think it's an interesting question, which I'd like to ask you, which is, while we're on this topic, before we move on, to what extent is the training of the guide important? Because there's a major difference between taking one of these powerful medicines with a, quote, sitter and taking it with a licensed therapist.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I don't think I refer to guy. Well, in the book, I refer to them as sitters, as opposed to referring to them as guides. Yeah, I ought to have probably made that relationship more explicit. But yeah, if you're good at sitting, you're good at guiding. If you're good at sitting, you're able to respond to the needs of your client in the moment in the most efficacious way. So you need to be trained as a good sitter. You could just sit there, bring a glass of water, but most people who trip with just one straight person with them are doing it for purposes of growth. So you want your sitter to be able to help you in that process. Your point early on about music and Leo and Beethoven, it got me thinking about you're saying that if you don't have music, then your own experience is acting as your guide. Um,
Yes,
I think though, too, you need a guide, to help
yes,
you when you get stuck or you need some help navigating.
right, both.
Yeah, so what kind of training is required? What kind of training is necessary? Um, well, I think, although it's not established scientifically, but it just can't help but be the case, that you have experience with the same compound, with the same medication, with the same drug. I think it is useful in cases of informed consent. You can describe what the person is going to experience, um, much better if you've had the experience yourself. Whether or not you'd be more empathic or more helpful, during sessions, you would think that's the case. And I think if anybody ever studies it, I, it will turn out to be the case. But I think you also need to have worked on yourself. You need to be a good therapist. You need to have been through therapy yourself. Like I went through a 4-year classical psychoanalysis, like up to 5 days a week on the couch. And
Wow.
I just spilled my guts out for years
Oh
and
my
years
God.
and years.
How did you possibly afford it? Wow.
Uh, well, he carried a debt. That's the way I afforded it. And once it got over a certain amount, I started having to pay interest. So I tried keeping
Boy.
it under that amount.
Wow.
So I mean, obviously, that's not the route for most people, but still, if you've had therapy, if you know what it's like to be in a therapeutic relationship, both as a therapist and as a patient, I think that's helpful. It makes it easier to to relate to somebody that's under the influence. You want to have a meditation practice or some kind of spiritual practice, either meditative or oriented towards prayer, but at least it ought to allow you to accept the existence of spiritual worlds that we normally can't see but exert influence. I think being comfortable with the existence of that realm of reality, and having some vocabulary, some methods, um, some advice along theological or spiritual um, platforms can be quite helpful. So if you can, well, and the whole issue of discipleship. I think when you're a psychedelic therapist, you are the object of a lot of um, you know, lots of adoration, and you can take it on. And I think if you've been in the position of either being a patient or being a disciple, I think it helps keep your modesty or y- your um, your grandiosity in check. Um, yeah, so I think to be a great sitter, you need a lot of training. To be a good sitter, you need good training, and so on.
You tell an interesting story about Leo with regard to the guide or the therapist, the sitter. I don't really like guide or sitter. Sitter sounds like a babysitter, and a guide sounds like someone who's going to lead you rather than let you go in your own direction and be there to support you. Um, but you talk about how Leo says, if a difficult situation comes up and you're considering giving some like a benzodiazepine
Right,
to the
right.
subject, better the guy takes the benzo and the Valium. And I laughed when I read that in your book and thought, right on, Leo, of course, because the last thing a person wants to see if they're having a difficult experience, referred to as quote a bad trip, the last thing they want to see is that the guide is scared. What they want to see is the guide is looking at it like, oh, I know what to do about this. I've seen it 100 times before. Let's get further into your darkness as a way of conquering it and mastering it. We have nothing to be afraid of. And Leo says the guide should take the benzo. That was great.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There was one time we gave one of our uh, psilocybin volunteers some Valium. I think I ought to have taken Leo's advice though, and taken it myself because it was just so tense. Uh, well, yeah, and I think that's another reason to be experienced with your own psychedelic trips is to be able to negotiate with that person the confusing, dark, depressing material that can come up. Um, well, so what do you think you should call, or what do you think that person should be called? Maybe a psychedelic friend.
I wish I could tell you, Rick. I haven't come up with something better, but I know those two words don't fit. I've mentioned it to Rick Doblin, to some other people. Maybe one of us will come up with something. But before we move on from DMT and talk a little bit about the benefits of psilocybin and LSD, you administered back in the day in your seminal groundbreaking work in 1990 or so. You administered 400 doses of DMT, as I recall.
Yeah, small, medium, and big doses.
What were there casualties?
Well, you mean deaths or adverse effects?
Any kind of casualty you want to share with us?
Well, thankfully no one died. Although one guy
Okay.
developed very high blood pressure and a stiff neck. So much higher blood pressure and much stiffer neck, he would have been stroking.
Do you,
You know,
do you
so
recall how high his blood pressure went?
it was. I mean, I've kind of blocked it out, but
Okay.
if I really struggle, I think it was 220 over 140. You know, something
Oh,
like that.
okay. Okay. Oh, it was very, very high. Okay.
It was really high, and it just shot up. Yeah. So that was a close call. And the stiff neck, that's from stretching of the blood vessels in the back of the neck that are going into your brain. That's what the
Yeah.
pain is. Yeah.
Did you all give him something like propranolol or something to take it down, or how did you handle it?
Well, I just took a deep breath and said it's going to be metabolized in 3 minutes. It's going to start coming down. If I give him, some verapamil, which is a calcium channel blocker, which is the antihypertensive we had on hand, he might go into shock because one of our guys started going into shock. So yeah, I just decided to sit tight and see how it
Okay.
worked out, and
And
thank
he
God it
came down.
worked out. Yeah, somebody developed, close to, shock. His blood pressure went down to 60 over 40, and his pulse went down to the 40s. And it was because of being so astounded by what the DMT revealed to him. He just couldn't, he was just in
Uh-huh.
shock, and he started going into
Uh-huh.
shock.
Uh-huh.
Um, let's see. A few people had psychological adverse effects. One guy developed some panic attacks, but he came back. He was a hypnotist, and worked on himself a lot, and he overcame the panic and resumed participation in the study. Did fine. Two people had recurrences of long ago depression. One responded to meds, one responded to therapy. Both quite quickly. One guy was anally raped by crocodiles on his big DMT experience. Was pinned to the bed, couldn't move, was absolutely just terrified, and you know he dropped out of the study. Clearly, and we needed to support him for a few weeks. And he came through all right. Moved to California, started working at a health food store in Santa Cruz, I think. Stopped taking drugs, that's for sure. Yeah, so it was not all a bowl of cherries. It was around 5%, maybe 10% of our volunteers. So one of the things I like to talk about is to not overlook adverse effects. That with increased accessibility, with the medicalization, there's going to be increased adverse effects just purely by the numbers. So it's interesting or important to think about what might be the percentage of experiences that result in some kind of problem.
Indeed.
Yeah, and if it's 5% in our group, or 10% in a group of experienced psychedelic users, I think in a group of unexperienced psychedelic users, the general population, it may be more than 10%.
I think this is extremely important data because I'm a person. If I ingest something, I want to know what the risks are, and I want to know the risk in numbers. And one of the things that I appreciate about your great book is that you're not coming from a place of these are all wonderful panaceas and there's no trouble. You're coming from a place of reporting what we know. And one of the things you say is that there is a risk, in your words, of coming unraveled. You specifically use those words, coming
Oh,
unraveled.
well, it's figurative. If you think of yourself as fairly well put together, I wouldn't say tightly wound, but at least you're in a ball. Yeah, and you can fragment, you can unravel. You're like a thread comes loose and the ball starts, unwinding. Yeah, and it could be just a few inches. It could be like a lot of the ball of yarn. Yeah, you can have transient anxiety. You can have anxiety that continues after you come down. You can have some depression or some sadness or some grief or self-derogation, during the trip afterwards or a few days down the road. But those kinds of problems can persist, can get worse. So that's the reason, number one, to advise people, and number two, to intervene very quickly if there seems to be some problems developing.
So, of the big four, let's say LSD, MDMA, psilocybin, DMT, I don't know if I'm leaving one out, maybe there's a five. Which which has the biggest chance, with which do you have the biggest chance of unraveling?
Well, I think with the classic compounds, the chance is much greater. Uh, so that includes LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, DMT, or ayahuasca. There was a German study came out a few months ago comparing LSD with psilocybin, fully psychoactive doses of both, in a group of experienced people, and there was no difference acutely. The only difference was duration of action.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a move to kind of sanitize the adverse effect profile of psilocybin. It's a mushroom. It's natural, grows in the earth. It doesn't have the baggage of LSD from the 60s, but still, the acute effects are indistinguishable. So I think anything, well, I was talking with somebody working at a pharmacy newspaper the other day, and she was wondering about the role of the pharmacist in dispensing psilocybin capsules. And I said, I hope that day never comes, because imagine handing out capsules full of LSD. Would you be as sanguine about the whole idea? So I think we would benefit in some ways by interchanging those names, LSD with psilocybin. It's only a question of duration of action. So you can experience the most fragmenting of your sense of self on the classical compounds. They, the effects last a while. You can really get yourself into tailspin. So I think with these, longer acting, shorter acting, you need somebody around, to help you navigate. Specifically, it's a bit interesting out there. 5-methoxy DMT, the toad. I think that there's going to be some push to commercialize it. It's a tryptamine. It's not that well known. It can help models of depression and drug abuse in lower animals. You smoke it on a retreat, and your depression improves. But it causes a lot of flashbacks. I have heard more reports of flashbacks from 5-methoxy DMT than any other compound. And I think it's because it obliterates uh, your sense of self, ego dissolution, which may not be a good thing. Especially, I don't know if you've seen those YouTube videos, people flopping around in streams and screaming, and they can't remember anything. I'm not sure if that is intrinsically a good thing. And there was an article that came out of the Netherlands. I think it was a field report of 5-methoxy retreat participants, and they both smoked it and used it intramuscularly. And I think those who smoked it, I mix up sometimes. Either those who smoked it or those who injected it intramuscularly experienced flashbacks. 69% prevalence. So it's one thing for a group of experienced psychonauts to have flashbacks. They can kind of work them through and understand them. But what if you're psychedelically naive? You have a 5-methoxy experience. It's just a white light. You don't know where the hell you are and what happened, and you come down and you start to have panic attacks the next couple of evenings. I don't think that's a good drug to kind of extend its accessibility. I mean, if people want to use it recreationally or otherwise in kind of specialized settings or mindsets, but I think commercializing it would be a mistake. There are other compounds out there that are probably just as effective.
I view psychedelics as sacramental medicines, and I don't to be used for inner space travel, and exactly what you describe in your book to deal with healing, to deal with prevention, to deal with creativity, all those that are inner work. I don't personally or professionally relate to a psychedelic that occurs and comes on in 0 to 60 in a nanosecond, and then you're over it in a very short period of time. Because when I've taken those, such as smoking DMT, and I'll tell you my experience, it was fascinating, but it happened so fast that I couldn't grab onto anything that I could then use in the real world. And so it becomes a trip at Coney Island. But I'm not taking psychedelics to go to Coney Island. I go to Coney Island for that. I want something where I can really learn something. And I was given DMT in 1967 when I was teaching at the University of Michigan. And I took a smoke into the universe, came back within 5 or 10 minutes. I said to the fellow, I'd like to try that again. He gave me another, again, out into the universe. I came back again. I looked at him and I said, I'm not an addictive person. I'm quite sure of it. But I could get addicted to this stuff. This is an amazing experience. I want to try it again. He gave it to me again. Out into the universe. Out in the middle of the universe, I see a big red sign, literally a big red sign. It says, caution. I hear a voice coming from out of nowhere. In a deep voice, it says, anything that moves you so quickly is to be very deeply respected. Use caution. I came back. He said, you want another? I said, I don't think I'm ever going to do this. I think I just got the word. I'm never going to do this again, but it was a great experience. But all I learned was to have deep respect and caution, but I didn't really grab something that I could use in everyday life.
Well, so let me so let me suggest that that you ought to have taken the fourth dose.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Well, your story of 3 consecutive DMT experience, it mirrors a study that we did giving DMT 4 times in the morning.
I saw that. Yes.
Yeah, the first was a big trip. The second was a big trip. The third trip was, oh, Jesus, I've had it. I don't want to do this again. That was routine. It was common. And, people would look up and say, have anybody, so have any other volunteers, quit at this point? And I would kind of tease them and say, not yet. And, the fourth dose, was uniformly a breakthrough. They kind of opened into whatever it was that had been constricting them, previously. Still, though, it's hard. I mentioned at the end of my DMT book the possibility of a continuous infusion of DMT, like for hours. It would be like an ayahuasca experience, but the pure drug, where there wouldn't be the beta carboline monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So I put that idea out there in 2001, and a Japanese colleague and friend, Andrew Gallimore, he's working in Japan. He and I published a paper, kind of sketching out the clinical reasons for continuous infusion, and some of the pharmacokinetic questions, like how fast and how much and for how long. Because you could understand that space, you could orient yourself in it much more easily if you could stay an hour there or a half hour, a few hours, and
Yes.
therapeutically, you can work on stuff at one level, you can turn it down and interact with your therapist at a lower level, and then you could just blast yourself out if that's what was called for at the time, and you could stay sober for 5 minutes, a half hour, so I think a more prolonged exposure to DMT would end up being more beneficial.
Yeah. And could you keep the doses low enough so you would be careful about cardiovascular effects?
Yeah, for sure. You would screen people and you would monitor them.
Yeah.
I'm consulting with a group at UCLA, the VA in West LA, and they're interested in post-traumatic stress disorder study using DMT in that way. Giving it 4 times in the course of a morning. I think the intervals would be longer and would probably be flexible, but still the specifics are yet to be worked out. But the overall plan seems to be to use that model in psychotherapeutic / psychedelic kind of setting.
In your book, you say the hallmark of any full psychedelic experience is the sense that it is, and I quote, more real than real. Talk to us about more real than real.
Well, it's kind of like pornography. Like the Supreme Court justice joked one day, he couldn't define pornography, but he knew it when he saw it.
Right?
So I think it's the same thing. It isn't like exactly the same thing, but still, it's a feeling. It's a conviction. It's an empirical gestalt, realization or more knowledge that what you're witnessing, apprehending, what you're immersed within is real. It isn't, it isn't deduced. It isn't like you think about it and perform experiments to determine if it's real or not. It's a feeling that what you're in is real. So that kind of begs the question about what's real. Is it just what you feel is real, or is it where you are most of the time, or what exactly? Which is one of the mind-boggling implications of the presence of endogenous DMT in the mammalian brain. The concentrations of DMT in the mammalian brain are comparable to those of serotonin and of norepinephrine and dopamine, which starts to build a case for there being a DMT neurotransmitter system. And if there were, that would mean that the brain's producing a compound that psychedelics, the brain's producing a compound that stimulates the same part of the brain that psychedelics do. So then you start to have to wonder, well, is this all just a psychedelic, narrowly defined window that we're all kind of dealing with? And when you really trip, like you increase levels of DMT or LSD in your brain, is that that revealing what is underneath, or more real than this narrow window that we exist in mostly.
How does the psychedelic experience of the experience being realer than real, how does that relate to the psychedelic near-death experience?
Yeah, well, the concentrations of DMT increase in visual cortex in the dying animal. That study or those data were reported in the same paper that talked about levels of DMT in the brain being high in the first place. So to the extent that the near-death state and the DMT experience resemble each other, the out-of-body sense, the feeling of it being more real than real, the visual characteristics, to the extent that those two experiences overlap, it makes sense to propose a role for naturally occurring DMT in the near-death state, and those recent data indicating high levels of DMT increasing in visual cortex in the dying animal supports a a possible role for naturally occurring DMT in the near-death state.
It would seem like realer than real, and you're having a death experience or an ego dissolution experience, which you describe. They can feel like you're really dying or that your ego is really dissolving. And that sort of underlines one of your messages in the book, which is to educate yourself about this before you take psychedelic, so that when it happens, you realize you're dealing with an effect of the medicine. You're not really dying, and you're not really unraveling, and your ego isn't really dissolving. But subjectively, it feels that way.
That's how it feels, right? Yeah, and I think that we interact with this so-called reality, that we continue to engage with it because it feels real, and that's really all that we can know. You can study.
Sorry.
Well, you can do experiments. When I was writing the Spirit Molecule, I had a brief correspondence with genius cosmologist at Oxford, David Deutsch, and I was going into some speculation about DMT allowing us to perceive into dark matter or parallel universes. And I asked David Deutsch about the parallel universe possibility, and he said you really wouldn't be able to tell in the moment. You could only deduce, working backwards, if you're living in a parallel universe or not. Which seemed like a chicken and the egg, snake swallowing its tail sort of thing. So I figured there wasn't much utility in pursuing that train of thought much further.
Rick, I have a theory about what's referred to as marijuana paranoia that I want to share with you. In our culture, when we have feelings inside, particularly uncomfortable ones, we're pretty much trained to look outside to see what's causing it. What's around me that's making me feel bad, or what people, instead of being trained to look inside at how we are creating that emotional state. So when people smoke marijuana, some have an increased heart rate and an increased blood pressure. When that occurs, some people are uncomfortable. They can feel the increased heart rate. They can feel the increase in blood pressure. And they get uncomfortable, and they start looking around for what the cause is. Am I in danger? Is the roof caving in? Is somebody looking in the window? Is a car following us? What's causing me to feel uncomfortable inside?
Right.
That looking outside instead of looking inside does not allow them to modulate those feelings as they could with breathing, which you point out, gratefully so, in your book. There's not much you miss in that book, by the way. It's such a great book. You cover so much.
Oh, thank you.
Instead of doing the breathing, which would then bring their blood pressure down and their heart rate down, they're looking around about what's following me, what's out there, what's in there, did I leave something burning in the oven, etc., all those things. What I'm leading up to is you have mentioned quite a few times in your book how certain psychedelics increase heart rate and blood pressure. And I'm wondering to what extent those physiological increases are contributing to what we call bad trips or something just short of bad trip, like uncomfortable trip.
Right, a lot of anxiety. Um, well, with the classical compounds, if they're taken orally, generally, they don't raise blood pressure and heart rate all that much. I think it's more of a psychological reaction, which then makes their heart rate go up and their blood pressure go up, and it's a vicious feedback loop. When you smoke DMT, obviously things increase just pharmacologically, but the cardiovascular effects pharmacologically of, let's say, LSD are they aren't especially profound. I think it kind of begins with anxiety. Um, Yeah, well, first of all, those people are no fun to smoke pot with if they have marijuana paranoia. Yeah, they kind of curl up in a ball. Well, one of the underlying or recurrent themes in that kind of condition is this painful self-awareness. They think that people are putting them down, that they're mocking them, that they're making fun of them. That seems like the most common features of that kind of marijuana paranoia thing. It isn't always the case that that's going on with classical psychedelics. Um, well, yeah, you just you need to communicate with those people if you can, and if you can't, just put them in a quiet, dimly lit space, sit next to them if need be, just help calm them down. One person who actually was going through that, I used the Leo Zeff Elijah method of laying on top of them, face to face, hand to hand, leg to leg, and it was perfect. I mean, they came down like within a minute or two. So obviously you need to make sure everything's cool, because that could be misinterpreted, obviously, sexually.
Very much
Yeah,
so.
yeah, yeah.
What
So
about, excuse me,
yeah, well, the guidelines. The longest chapter in the book is about how to trip, and I spent some time discussing guidelines between you, if you're by yourself, with you, or between you and the other people in your space if you're not tripping alone. Guidelines need to be explicit. uh, no always means no, it never means yes. Yes can become no. Yes isn't always yes. So um, if you're going to be laying on just someone when they're really anxious, you might want to, well, I mean, you're practically speaking, if you're smoking pot with a friend and they blow it like that, I mean, you don't have time to give them an informed consent. But still, there'd be an understanding, and you would be sensitive to nuances that you weren't imposing on them, those kinds of matters.
of the four biggies, LSD, psilocybin, ayahuasca, and MDMA, you talk the most about the cardiovascular effects on MDMA. You seem most concerned about that. You seem most concerned about MDMA as a medicine in terms of potential liabilities.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm kind of swimming against the tide in that respect, but the whole question of neurotoxicity, it can increase your blood pressure and your heart rate, and if you got problems with your heart, you ought to be super careful, or completely avoid it, or work with your cardiologist, but the more troubling uh, aspects of especially repeated MDMA use is the question of neurotoxicity. It seems that the more MDMA you take, the more neurotoxicity there is. So I think it's prudent, to limit your exposure. It's the risk benefit analysis as well. Like, for example, in the case of treatment resistant PTSD, if you've tried everything under the sun and you still are really ill, MDMA is worth it. But if you just want to have fun, and you want to take MDMA like every week or every month or something for years on end, that probably is more benefit than risk. No, I'm sorry, that's more risk than benefit.
Well,
But in
interesting you say that, because I was just going to share with you that I know several couples who have taken MDMA 3 or 4 times a month, almost every weekend, for over 5 years.
wow,
And one of them was I wrote about in my book Psychedelic Medicine. Dr. Alan Ajaya, he talked openly about it. Also taken hundreds of LSD trips. Well, I've interviewed many people who have taken hundreds and hundreds of LSD trips and seem no worse for the wear. I have a few examples of people taking hundreds of MDMA without problems, but the problem people don't necessarily want to come and talk to me or share it with me.
yeah, and those problems in a mostly healthy person might just come up on brain scans or neuropsychological testing, and they may not be, and they may not be clinically relevant. The classical compounds are non-neurotoxic, LSD, psilocybin, DMT, and mescaline. There's no neurotoxicity. So it's always seemed to me like if you want an MDMA experience, just take a small amount of psilocybin. That's not exactly true, but I think it's true enough. You can increase your empathy, especially if it's taken in that kind of setting. With a medium dose of a classic compound.
Maybe 3 grams of dry.
It would just depend on the mushrooms.
Yeah. Talk to us about a phenomenon you describe in your book called stimulated imagination that comes from psychedelics.
Yeah, well, that's kind of getting in the weeds, but still, I do include that in the book. It
caught my attention. It seemed like a fascinating concept.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's an old idea. It harkens back to Aristotle's metaphysics, which divides the mind into what's called an imaginative faculty and a rational faculty, or the intellect. So the intellect, deals with ideas, concepts, notions, non-measurable things, non-observable, with sensation kinds of things, and the imagination is the arena of everything else. So it isn't imagination as in imaginary or make believe. It's the imagination as in non-rational. So if you think of the intellect as the location of ideas and thoughts, knowledge, information, and you think of the imagination as the location of perception, visual and auditory, tactile, feelings, your emotions, your body sensations, your body awareness, those kinds of things. Those are things which are kind of held in the imaginative realm, the imaginative faculty, and everything else, abstract intellections, those reside in the intellect, or the rational faculty. So I think that psychedelics primarily stimulate the imagination, because just look at the way that the term psychedelic was co-opted back in the 60s and the 70s as representing some kind of aesthetic, as opposed to a new philosophy. The philosophies were borrowed from the New Age or from the East or from certain Christian or Jewish streams, but the aesthetic was new and was emphasized, and it became kind of perverted into this garish caricature, visually, auditorially. But I think that's a reflection of psychedelics uh, stimulating new combinations of ingredients in the imagination. So to make your psychedelic experience more than simply an aesthetic one, emotional and perceptual and somatic, you can extract information from the contents of the imagination. And the way of extracting information from the contents of the imagination is through a well-developed intellect, through study, contemplation, tradition, practicing virtue and piety. Make yourself a good person with your mind full of good thoughts, and you'll be able to get more out of the uh, uh, the visions, so to speak, than would otherwise be the case. Otherwise, it would be mostly um, a visual, oh wow, exotic experience. But if you can get something out of it, which you can articulate in words, write down, share with other people, I think you're able to maybe make more of those experiences.
When you say the better develop the intellect, the more one can extract from psychedelics, does that mean in some way that you advocate for us to wait till a certain period of life or a certain age until we take these medicines?
I think in the ideal world, well, kind of like Islands, by Huxley. You take one substance at a certain age, then another one at a certain age, then then and then another one at a certain age. I think that's a reflection of one's intellectual development, your studies, your education. So the more educated you are, the more you're able to understand what you're seeing, to make some sense of it, as opposed to just simply beholding it. There is value in beholding things which you've never beheld before, but I think if you want to diffuse, kind of spread out, optimize those experiences, if you can, share them verbally, understand them, and articulate them, verbally, so your intellectual development, continues. Piaget, language development and moral development and whatnot. The age of moral responsibility for your actions. That takes time. So you know if there ever were to be a psychedelic society, or one in which psychedelics played a role, like from A to Z, then you could formulate certain developmental stages that would be best suited for one drug or the other.
Given how suggestible some of us are when we take psychedelics, and given the known effect of trance state on people, how concerned are you about psychedelic tourism, where people are flocking to South America to take psychedelics in the jungle with, quote, shaman, unquote?
Well, I think it's buyer beware. Uh, do your research. Um, the things I've been hearing with respect to those ayahuasca retreats, or San Pedro retreats, toad retreats, is integration. They tend to give you a lot of medicine in a short period of time, and you can understand it in the jungle with shamans doing their thing and then explaining things using their worldview, and you're suggestible, you believe it, it makes sense, it's making inroads into your psyche in a way that otherwise wouldn't be the case. But once you get home, and I think it can be hard to integrate the shamanic worldview with most people's everyday lives.
Salvia divinorum is legal in the United States, but it's not getting much action as a psychotherapeutic medicine. Are we missing out there? Is there potential? Should we be looking at it? Talk to us about salvia.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think I relate to her as Sylvia. By the way, I always think of this.
Yeah, that's the name of my espresso maker. It's called Sylvia. Well, yeah, salvia. Yeah, it comes. Well, it's a mint. It is in the mint family. The active ingredient is is called salvinorin A, and it's quite potent. It's almost as potent as LSD. It's active in the 200 microgram range. 250 is a pretty full dose of salvia divinorum or of salvinorin A. Most people I've spoken to, and myself, it was a very dysphoric experience. It was very unpleasant, and one of the frequent explanations for the unpleasantness is the physical effects. It feels as if you're dissolving, kind of turning into sand or stretching out. My experience, I smoked it like a long time ago when it was just discovered you could smoke the pure drug. Daniel Siebert was sending it to his friends, and I got some, and I way overdosed, and the roof or the ceiling opened up in my bedroom. I was lying on the bed. My wife at the time had gave it to me, and this man, this 40-foot man wearing a bowler cap and a brown suit, looked down at me and he said, "It's time to go now." And he started to stretch my skin from my arm onto his pant leg, and I was being pulled along by this guy walking across the meadow in front of our house. And it was like, man, I don't really want to go there. And a lot of other people just hate salvinorin, but still, there are people that it gets along with. There was a study at Hopkins and a study at Harvard, where they recruited people who takes salvinorin, and they like it, and they studied them and drew blood and gave questionnaires and things. So there is, it's a unique, drug, pharmacologically. It stimulates the kappa opioid receptor as opposed to the serotonin one. And, so it could be useful, theoretically in opioid abuse or withdrawal, kind of like Ibogaine is active at the kappa site too. Or, pain, kappa sites are important in pain perception. But I think as an antidepressant or anti-anxiety agent, I think it's going to be pretty niche because of the adverse effects.
You spend a great deal of time in your book, and thankfully so, talking about preparation for the psychedelic experience. And you point out how Leo Zeff, our secret chief, said that the psychedelic experience begins when you start thinking about taking the psychedelic. And I thought that was a great point when you said it that way, because that really is the beginning. And you go on to talk about the importance of reading, of studying, of psychology, and also religion. But you then point out that people should be careful to avoid cults. And what popped into my mind was, well, what are the major religions other than cults that made good? Aren't they this cult that have the biggest number of people and they're successful?
Well, you're speaking, I think, mostly about organized religion.
Yes, and those are the ones you refer to when you say talk to those people, as part of your preparation. If you're affiliated, you're not pushing.
Yeah, if you're drawn to discussing
right
with the cleric. Well, I may not have made the point as clearly as I could have in the book. I distinguish between the institution which has grown around the religion, the belief system, the experiences. Like, for example, I am a great student of the Hebrew Bible. I mean, I read it every day. It converted me from Zen to being Jewish again. But I don't belong to any organized Jewish community. No synagogue. I don't have a rabbi. I've got mentors who are rabbis. But I have approached the tradition solely through scripture. Kind of like Luther. Solely scripture, as opposed to the clerics telling me what to do and what to donate to, and who to do this with and who not to do that with. The clerics are clerics are a menace, but still, it's like what we were discussing earlier on in the program, is that most people would rather be told what to do, rather than investigate themselves. And for most people, it's easier to be under the guidance or the regulation or the strictures of a clerical establishment. It's easier than studying biblical Hebrew and the commentators and the midrash and all that. I mean, that takes a lot of work. So I think it's not something that is for everyone. When I was talking about speaking with your cleric, I was more thinking about speak to your pastor, somebody that can discuss your concerns at a theological level, but just discuss them, as opposed to imposing them or constraining them in any way.
Uh-huh. You talk about the importance of intention. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I want to quote that you raised three important questions for people to ask themselves with regard to their intention in terms of taking psychedelics. You say, ask yourself, why am I taking it? You say, ask yourself, what do I hope to gain? And what do I hope to avoid? These are three great questions, important questions to ask. Why am I taking it? What do I hope to gain? What do I hope to avoid? Now, we're going to leave, that's intention, before the fact. We're going to leave integration, which is after the fact, for last. But just short of that, we're going to talk a little bit about something that's taking the country by storm, which is microdosing.
Microdosing.
So talk to us about microdosing with these various psychedelic medicines. By the way, you must note that I keep referring to these substances as medicines.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason for that. In 1985, when I met Rick Doblin at Esalen at a conference, I said, Rick, we have to stop talking about marijuana as a drug. We have to talk about marijuana as a medicine. The only way we're going to get a foot in the door towards legalization is through medical marijuana first, then recreational. But it has to be a medicine first. And every time you refer to it as a drug, it brings up in people's minds drugs and druggies and hippies and illegal and criminals. And drugs have bad connotations, bad baggage. So I'm taking the same tack with the psychedelics, and I'm doing my best to refer to them as medicines. And you talk about microdosing as a medicine. Give us a little summary on microdosing with LSD, with psilocybin.
Well, you must have been at that meeting at Esalen when I was there. 1985. Rick Doblin called me in like December '84, my article on adverse effects of psychedelics, came out in October '84 as my first, major psychedelic writing. And he tracked me down. I was at UNM. I just been there a month or two, or maybe I just arrived. And he says, "I'm Rick Doblin. I'm organizing a meeting at Esalen next year. You want to come?" And I said, "Sure." So I attended that meeting.
I had a feeling we met at that meeting, but so many years went by, I couldn't put the face with the face.
Yeah, and you were telling Rick to stop calling them, drugs. Even back then, I was telling Rick, get your PhD in clinical psychology. So
Yeah,
we both gave him advice that he has, followed more or less.
he has. He's followed both of them, definitely.
Yeah.
You might recall he also said he was going to give MDMA to every member of Congress.
Right. But speaking of terminology, last month when I was on Joe Rogan's podcast, I brought up the word God. I figured every chance I get, and so Joe said, "Oh, you can call it that," and he started saying, "You shouldn't call it God," and I said, "Well, I think he made the commonly made point, which is God has been abused, kind of used to justify all kinds of horrible things." And I said to him, "Well, look at the word love. I mean, it's been applied to the worst possible behaviors as well. So we need to to reclaim the word love just as much as we need to reclaim the word God." So then we got off on to other topics. But I think it is I think drugs are drugs. They're pharmacological agents that affect biological systems. So it's more generic. It's like psychedelic. It encompasses a whole range of phenomena. But still, I completely understand you're using the word medicine. It makes a lot of sense. You're talking about microdosing. Jim Fadiman was a mentor of mine at Stanford. I met him in '72. Like I was between my junior and senior year at Stanford, and I was totally like, what am I going to do with my life? I want to study psychedelics, but the Controlled Substances Act was passed, and I'm not interested in becoming a doctor, and just all those kinds of things. So I went to student health and spoke to their psychiatrist there, and I said, this is what I'm concerned about. And he said, "You should meet Jim Fadiman. He's working in the engineering corner, someplace on campus." So I called Jim, and we arranged to meet. And one of the things that he told me was look into the pineal gland. Like I was 20 years old, I hadn't I'd never heard of the pineal gland. So Jim introduced me to the pineal gland and all of the various things which I grew out of my study of the pineal. So Jim. Jim was at a meeting with me and Ralph Metzner and the Greys and a couple other people who may not want to be mentioned or not. And it was Bicycle Day in San Francisco, maybe 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, and we were convening to start talking about a psychedelic church, like an above board psychedelic church. Get all the paperwork and give psychedelics to people who want to trip in a sacred, holy manner. And Ralph was there, Ralph Metzger, and he said, "No, keep it underground. Keep it underground. Once you start regulating it, it's a mess." And so, we were kind of saying, "Oh, you can do it. It's just paperwork and increased accessibility and stuff." But in retrospect, I think Ralph had a point. So Jim was there too. And it was, long before his microdosing work. So, gosh, it may have been even longer ago. And Jim said, microdosing is the way to start to spread into the mainstream. to make them acceptable, to make more people, to help encourage, people to use them, and start to, and start to learn what they can do. So I've known, Jim a long time, and we've kind of crossed, paths over the years. And, Jim also, was the one to introduce me, to Shasta Abbey and, Kenneth Roshi, who, was my Zen community, for over 20 years. So Jim was, quite helpful over, like I'd see him every 15 years, and he'd say, do this. It's like, oh yeah, great. And, the impact was, continues to reverberate. But getting back to microdosing, yeah, it's all the craze. I think it depends on what your microdoses are. You can conveniently, more or less define them as, tiny, small, or I forget, what I say, but, tiny, very small and small. Tiny would be you have, no acute effect at all. It's like you took a sugar pill. There's no subjective experience which occurs after you take it. So, pharmacologically, if you took that kind of dose, like every day, maybe every week, there still would be antidepressant-like effects. There was a few studies, one in particular in the early days, you're giving a small amount of LSD every day as an antidepressant, to inpatient, depressed people. And within a few days, there were no more psychedelic effects. There was a small dose anyway, or, subjective effects. Patients stopped experiencing any acute subjective effects. But over time, in the same kind of time course as would occur with antidepressants, their depression improved. So I think you can effect an antidepressant effect without any subjective effects. It wouldn't be as strong, perhaps, as something else, or with a bigger dose of therapy. But if you're just taking a super small dose with absolutely no effects, it would be acting like an antidepressant. The neurogenesis, the neuroplasticity. Very small doses would be a bit like caffeine. You'd be a bit more alert, stimulated, more energy. And if you were taking a very small dose with some some mild subjective effects,
a
on
little
a
J
daily
and D.
basis or a weekly basis, you would also feel antidepressant effects. Small doses are ones which give you a hint of what's to come if you increase the dose. Things might be a little sparkly in the room, whatnot. But those are my clinical impressions. The data out there, at least laboratory data, are very rudimentary. They're mostly using between the very small and the small doses. So there is an acute subjective effect. People feel something, but it isn't like a mood elevating effect. It's an energy effect. They're determining these kinds of descriptions, based on rating scales, more than anything else.
But based on your knowledge of the pharmacology, if you take a very small sensate dose, say less than 10 micrograms of LSD, is there enough effect on the neurotransmitters to warrant then taking 2 days off before your next administration, as Jim and some others are recommending? Or might you just as well take it every day because the small dose is not depleting your serotonin, not having an effect on your dopamine?
Right. Well, if you were, gauging your frequency of dosing, purely on the neurogenesis and neuroplasticity effects, In the case of psilocybin, once a month would be adequate. The neuroplastic changes persist for a month in laboratory animals after a single dose of psilocybin. If you were interested in an antidepressant effect, you theoretically could take it every day. But I think our understanding of how antidepressants work is evolving too. It may be the case we only would need to take Prozac once a week or once a month, because the neuroplastic and neurogenesis effects are prolonged after single exposure.
But that would take away the annuity for the pharmaceutical companies.
Mm-hmm, right, exactly. Yeah, there aren't many.
Now,
You'd make more. Well, you could develop a new, formulation of Prozac, which is 7 times more expensive if you only take it once a week.
yes. Well, we have a little bit of time left. Let's talk about integration. You've had your psychedelic experience. How do you integrate it to make it part of your life?
Integration, yeah, that's a big question. Well, theoretically, or in an ideal world, you would continue what you were doing before you tripped with more vigor, with more conviction. If, for example, you're an activist and you want to spread world peace, and you're not quite as firmly emplaced with your beliefs and with your actions, and you want to work on that during your trip, hopefully you will have experienced those ideas, those beliefs, those aspirations in a more convincing manner. They're even more important now than they were before. They're even truer. They're even more meaningful, and you would continue your life being inspired. You would have had inspiration, and you would continue playing it out forward. If there's any take home, I suppose, if you are new to the field, so to speak, one of the pieces of advice that I like to give is occupy yourself once you've come down and you're back to your daily life, to occupy yourself with things that remind you of the best parts of your trip. So if it involves being in the natural, in the natural world, spend more time in nature. If it involves singing, then sing more. If it involves study more. If it involved communicating therapeutically, romantically, do more of that. You're being shown something which is meaningful, to you in that state. And if you've done your homework, you want to become a better person as a result of your tripping, and you can work on the strengthening of those beliefs in your in your daily life afterwards. Like if you meditated better than ever before on psilocybin, then double your efforts at your meditation practice. Those kinds of things.
Well, thank you. I think we've come to the end, unless there are any things that you want to mention that you think we might have forgotten.
I think you need to be open-minded about your experiences. There's a big emphasis on the mystical experience nowadays. Ego dissolution, the white light, no more time, space, or self. If you've got that as a goal, it can detract from experiences of real value, which are not mystical, unitive, white light experiences. And also, if you've got that as a goal, you may end up disappointed that you didn't attain it. So I think we need to approach our experiences as, come what may. If we want something to take place, fine, but we, can't be steered, by our preconceptions. It was like what you were, talking about earlier, about, Beethoven. Like, enough Beethoven already. I want to have my own trip. So I think you want to have your own trip. That was our DMT study protocol. Have your own trip and come back and report what happened. I didn't say this is going to be, or this is that, or you're going to enter the chakras or things. It was like keep your eyes open, take careful notes, and tell us what it was like. So there was no disappointment, or generally on people just had their own trips and reported, and I was as interested in this kind as that kind. So don't get zealous. Don't become part of a mystical experience cult. And if you don't attain to that state, you're somehow failure. You want to. Everybody's different. Everybody's experiences are different.
Okay, folks, that's the last word from Dr. Rick Strassman. Have your own trip and come back and report it to us. You want to go out, go to Amazon, check out his book, The Psychedelic Handbook. You're going to want to read it for sure. Thank you, Rick, for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Richard. It was a lot of fun.
I hope so. I know you do a lot of interviews. And thank you all for listening to today's broadcast of Mind, Body, Health, and Politics. Until you join me again next time, this is Dr. Richard Lewis Miller reminding you that good health is worth fighting for, and it's essential for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.